work from the ancient world, including Tacitus, including Livy, including Suetonius, and including the Talmud. It's all going to become a blank slate, and we may as well adhere to the thesis that history actually started with the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages were a fraud, which is a real thesis, by the way.
So there's the problem then, surely, Ken, that if you're discounting the Gospels because we only have later copies, we don't have the originals, and then you're kind of denying us any history.
No. I mean, we get the danger of creating a caricature here. Let me answer part of what JP has said here by referring to something. It used to be a standard comment in my emails from Christians that there is as much evidence of Jesus as there is for Julius Caesar. Now, I heard that so often, I did write an article specifically on Julius Caesar to illustrate how we can have a great deal of confidence, in fact complete confidence, that Julius Caesar existed because of the mass of interlocking and mutually supportive evidence. Now, that's different when we come to someone like Jesus. We don't have a mass of interlocking and mutually supporting evidence. We have evidence of generations of doctrinal disputes. We have the Gospels from the Marcions. We have the Gospels from the Docetists. We have, evidence of all manner of heresies that, strangely enough, emerge very early on in this so-called religion, and it's less plausible that the pure doctrine subtly metamorphosed into 80 or 100 heresies than in actual fact the truth is probably that out of that whole ocean of religious thinking, certain ideas crystallise and eventually were given official form in the faction that happened to then manage to cement itself into the Roman political system.
And are you saying that the Gospels then are effectively the crystallised thoughts and traditions that won the day, if you like?
Indeed I do. And if we have time, we can trace through. Let's take the very basic fact that we know about the Synoptic Gospels, that Matthew and Luke are based upon Mark. Now, most scholars, I don't know if JP does, but most scholars will agree that is the case. Now, what is the relationship there? Mark wasn't one of the disciples. He is not claimed to be an eyewitness, and yet Matthew supposedly was one of the disciples and an eyewitness. Why does Matthew, an eyewitness, copy the text provided by a non-witness? I mean, that's the sort of nonsense that you have if you try and take the official story as being valid. What we have in Mark, in its original form, was a much shorter gospel. It had nothing about the birth of Jesus. It had nothing about the resurrection appearances. A very brief document, which in Matthew and in Luke was embellished and developed into a much more comprehensive doctrine.
I feel like we're opening a whole new area here, and unfortunately we're already approaching near the end of the show, so I'll allow JP to respond, and then we may have to start to wind things up.
Okay. There's not much. I do have articles on each of those issues that he's mentioned. My article on the virgin birth covers the issue of Mark not mentioning it. In terms of the Markan priority Q thesis, I do adhere to Matthean priority. I have great detailed articles on that. But
what do you mean by that? Just for those who may not understand quite what.
It means that Matthew wrote first, or I believe it was written in Aramaic or Hebrew first, and Mark wrote later or at a different time independently of Matthew. Both are based on the common oral tradition that the
okay, so both Mark and Matthew both depended on an earlier source.
Yeah,
so it's not Matthew copying Mark; it's them both copying an earlier source, and Matthew incorporating that into his eyewitness account.
Right, oral tradition, and Luke, I do think, had hold of an early form of Matthew and of Mark. Now, I'll just go back for this topic to the issue of Julius Caesar. I have an article on that too, and there's a lot of issues involved in that. Like, do they mean it's usually connected to Caesar crossing the Rubicon in the analogies I've seen? And there's some question: do you mean Caesar crossing it personally, like stepping over the river himself, or does that mean his army crossing, and so on? And what I concluded is that this is not really a good analogy to use for Jesus. The better analogy was someone like Gamaliel or Socrates, who was a teacher, not a military leader, not someone who was a great force in government, because that does not describe Jesus adequately, especially not as the pagan writers would have seen him. And this is a critical mistake that's often made, and I've seen it on Ken's website as well. He asks why various people like Appian or Plutarch don't mention Jesus. Well, again, we have this confusion between Jesus as a person and Jesus as a miracle worker. When you have someone like Plutarch, Let's say he hears about Jesus for the first time. Well, he's not going to be willing to grant that this Jewish peasant who was shamefully crucified was actually someone who did miracles. He's simply going to dismiss that as an unworthy story without any further investigation and not report it. And so we can't be expecting these authors to adopt the viewpoint of the Christians, as it were. Otherwise, they would be Christian sources if they agreed that Jesus did all these miracles. Or they'd be like Celsus and say, well, he was a magician of some kind, learned his craft in Egypt. The practice, again, we need to compare to comparable figures like Gamaliel, like Socrates, like Confucius, who were teachers with a circle of disciples. We would mostly expect the followers to provide the information about that person. As with Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, mostly his followers wrote about him. With Gamaliel, we have mostly the Talmud. In the case of the New Testament, that's what we would expect the most information to come from Jesus. Now, we obviously don't have time to get into these ideas of fractions and different heresies and whatnot, and I suppose there's no way to really sum it up simply. But, at some point you could discuss the specific heresies and whatnot. But again, this is all very broad and vague as we have it right now. And I continue to maintain that this is simply a matter of inventing rules as we go along, simply in order to dispose of Jesus as a real person.
Fascinating discussion, gentlemen, and I wish we had more time to delve into some of the aspects of this, but it is a huge area, as I said right out at the beginning, and well, if you want to visit Ken or JP's site, you will be able to delve to your heart's content into some of the various aspects of what we've been talking today and beyond. Let me just give you the website addresses again. JP Holding, our Christian on the program today, you can find his articles and thoughts at tectonics.org, tectonics with a K, and Ken Humphreys, JesusNeverExisted.com. So we're going to come back to you, gentlemen, just for some final thoughts from you both as we conclude the program. If you're listening and you'd like to respond yourself, then you're more than welcome to get in touch with the program. Just time for a quick wrapping up, just a couple of minutes each, if you don't mind, and we'll let you go first, Ken, and then we'll have JP to finish us off. I mean, one thing that's come through time and time again from JP, Ken, is you're not being fair. You're asking a different level and a different level of, if you like, hyper-skepticism in regard to the evidence for Jesus that you're not demanding for other similar characters of a similar nature of the time, Gamaliel and others, and this just won't do. We're not asking the question, did Jesus perform various miracles and rise from the dead? We're just asking, did Jesus exist? And on that level, the vast majority of historians agree. You're
but you see, I think, yes, many historians would say that. They choose their words very, very carefully when they do. We are not concerned here with establishing just any old person. That is the crucial thing. We would probably want, we don't even have to look at the historical record if we want to conclude there was someone in Nazareth called Jesus. I mean, that is we can say, well, given the frequency of the name, there were always often going to be people. We know that Josephus mentions a whole bunch of people called Jesus. So if you just want to be comfortable with the idea there was someone around called Jesus, I don't have any problem with that. There were hundreds of them, thousands of them called Jesus. What we're trying to establish is a particular person. Now, what marks that particular person out from the rest? It is these very things you say now that don't matter. It was the fact that he worked miracles. It was the fact that he raised the dead. If he did none of those things, we wouldn't even be talking about him today. Now,
but I mean, surely though, it's also he was, had a trial under Pontius Pilate. He was crucified. Those aspects of the story are what mark out the Jesus we're talking about. We're not talking about some random Jesus.
There are difficulties in believing they are, historical events. They conform to nothing that would be appropriate for the time and circumstance. I think, and I mean, we obviously have run out of time, but I think what we have here is evidence, but not evidence of an historical Jesus. We have evidence of an evolving myth, and that's what we can demonstrate in great detail without many special pleading. We don't have special pleading. We can see how ideas at one stage were embellished and developed into more elaborate ideas at another. And we could go through verses of the Passion narrative. We could go through any number